Hey guys, how's everyone doing? 1000 pi points to Gayback. No, sorry, Greyback. My apologies. Um, so it's 11th of November. And do you guys know what day it is? I'll just give you a couple of seconds to comment. Don't Google it. It's a question for 100 pine points. What anniversary it is today? Yep, it's of course the anniversary of the end of the First World War. I think it's 102 years today. Doesn't the time just fly by when you're having such a good time? So some housekeeping first. Somebody mentioned that they can't actually listen to the stream on FloatTube. I don't know what the issue is. I wasn't able to find any problems. So let me know if that still is the case. I think it might be the case that when I created the first stream, I accidentally clicked that it's content for children, but I fixed it. So it should be fine now. But anyway, let me know in the chat and I'll take a look into it. And also, I'm not sure if you noticed, but some of the older videos that I created don't have any audio. And that's because I downloaded them from YouTube. And for some reason, they just downloaded without audio. And I can't do anything about it. It seems to be independent on which service I use to download them. So again, if anyone knows what's wrong with it, let me know. That would be great. I just privated those videos for now. So that's that. And before we get to today's topic, let me actually talk about the channel a little bit, because I want to actually announce the first ever subscriber goal. And the subscriber goal is to reach 1,000 pine points. Sorry, 1,000 subscribers. That was a Freudian slip. 1,000 subscribers by the end of the year. And the reason I want to get to 1,000 subscribers is because if your channel gets 1,000 subscribers, you will be able to create community posts, which are just short text posts that subscribers see. And the reason why I want to do that is because of this. Do you guys know how at the end of every stream, including today, we just switch topics and we talk about something completely different, usually something funny from ancient history, or at least interesting, that's not related to the main topic of the stream? Well, where am I getting that content from? Actually, for the last at least 5 years, as I was reading through primary ancient sources, I took notes, writing down everything that I find either funny or interesting. And I have like pages and pages of that. So I can pull it very easily out. And I want to share that amazing content with you. And it's usually too short for a video. And I think there is just so much of it that it's not enough to do it once at the end of every stream. So I thought we would stream once a week on Wednesday, and then maybe on Monday and Friday, I would just create a community post with this interesting snippet of content. And in order to entice you, I want to show you what kind of interesting stuff I have at my disposal. So let's just go through 3 examples. This is a brief passage from the first Maccabees. And the armies joined battle on the 13th day of the month Adar, and the army of Nicanor was defeated, and he himself was the first slain in the battle. My witty commentary to that is, I see the army was controlled by the AI from Rome Total War. Am I right? I'm sure that at least some people in the audience know exactly what I'm talking about. In the original Rome Total War game, it's very often happened that for some reason the AI just charged you, and the general unit, cavalry unit, charged first. And because the general model was usually at the front of the formation, he was literally the first person to die in the battle. And if you were fighting an army with low morale and you had a lot of the general had a lot of morale boost, then he died and the entire army routed. So you won the battle. There was just one casualty, the general, and everyone else just ran away immediately. So that's one example. What do we have next? Oh yeah, this is an excerpt from Herodotus, and I'm going to read it. And you guys think if this sounds familiar. He built the great and mighty circles of walls within walls, which are now Ecbatana. It's a city in the Persian Empire. This fortress is so planned that each circle of walls is higher than the next outer circle. There are 7 circles in all. So, what is this? Where else have you seen it? How about here? It's Minas Tirith, right? 7 circles of walls, like within each other. It's like a Russian nesting doll of walls. So another interesting example of content that I have available are all the places from the primary sources that Tolkien just ripped out or ripped off, or at least he was inspired by them, right? And then Herodotus actually goes on. He says the battlements of the first circle are white, of the second black, of the third circle purple, of the fourth blue, and of the fifth orange. Thus, the battlements of 5 circles are painted with colors, and the battlements of the last 2 circles are coated, these with silver and those with gold. So again, just think about Tolkien's work. Does this sound like anything? Where in Tolkien do we have a series of gates or walls like this? Does anyone know what this is from Tolkien's lore? It's not Minas Tirith. It's actually the secret city of Gondolin, right? From the First Age, from Beleriand. And if I'm not mistaken, in the tale of Tuor and his coming to Gondolin, it describes that it wasn't actually 7 circles because the entire city was in a valley surrounded by mountains. So it was very difficult to get to. And there was just one passage, which was kind of gated by 7 gates. And each gate was built from a different material. It was, I think, wood, stone, bronze, iron, silver, gold. And I don't remember what the last material was. So that's another interesting piece of content that you guys could consume if we get to 1,000 subscribers. And the third example is, by the way, the description of Herodotus is fantastical. That's probably not how Ecbatana looked like. I wasn't able to find a reconstruction. So this is a palace from Persepolis, which was another important city in the Persian Empire. And as you can see, it's actually surprisingly small, you know. In primary sources, Greek sources, you will find these amazing descriptions of how wealthy and like opulous these Mesopotamian and Persian palaces were. But if you actually look at the reconstruction, they are still great. Definitely much greater than what you would find in Greek cities, because Greece was actually very poor in the Mediterranean world. They were like some highlanders, you know, herding goats and sheep. But yeah, still, it's, I think, much more modest than what the picture that you get from these descriptions. And the third example of interesting content is this. This is the longest word in Greek. It's found in one of the last lines of Assemblywoman, which is a play by Aristophanes, comedy by Aristophanes. It's the very end of the story where all the conflict is already resolved, and essentially the characters are celebrating. And this is a description of a meal, and it's just a mashup of all the different ingredients that are in it. It's one of the actually longest words in any language. It's not the longest. I think that word record is held by one of the Hindu languages in a very old text written in Sanskrit. And I'm not talking, by the way, about proper names, right? When we get to proper names, yeah, there are villages in Wales that have like crazy long names, right? I'm actually talking about a word, like a different kind of word that you could maybe use in everyday conversation. I was thinking about reading it, but no. So yeah, this is the kind of amazing stuff that I can just keep pumping for your entertainment. But in order to do that, we would have to crack those 1,000 subscribers. And here's the call to action for all of you. I'm sure that most of you are probably members of some great debate community groups on various platforms. It could be, for example, Facebook discussion groups. It could be subreddits, something like that. So what I want all of you to do right now is to grab, is to grab a link to this stream right now as I'm talking to you and just paste it as a post in one of those groups. And if everyone watching today does that, I think we should be on 1,000 subscribers in no time. So yeah, let's get to the topic of this video. And actually, before we start, don't you guys love it when you're right? I love it. And it seems that I was actually right. So the last time we were talking about the traditional authorship of the canonical Gospels, and I made an interesting, prediction or estimate. I thought, and as I said, that based on what I know about Mike Licona, the prominent Christian, conservative, evangelical apologist, and New Testament scholar, I guess, as well, based on what I know he says, I think that he thinks that the Gospel of Matthew wasn't actually written by Matthew, the tax collector and apostle from Galilee, personally selected by Jesus. He probably thinks that this Matthew, this guy, wrote Q, the imaginary source of the material that both the Gospel of Matthew and the Gospel of Luke have in common. That was written by Matthew, according to Mike Licona. And that's the text that Papias of Hierapolis is talking about in early 2nd century, right? And the Gospel of Matthew was actually written by anonymous author or a group of authors who used the Gospel of Mark as a literary blueprint. They adjusted it, they changed things around, and they incorporated this Q material and call it the Gospel according to Matthew, because it was kind of the Matthew version updated with this Q material. But I don't know if this is what Mike Licona actually thinks, but my very trusted informant actually told me that, yes, Mike Licona is actually on record saying exactly this, and it can actually be found in one of the 3 videos that he did recently with Josh Pelletier on the dating and authorship of the Gospel of Mark. I still haven't been able to watch those videos, not because I don't have enough time or anything. I just know that the argumentation that they present is so powerful and convincing that I would just have to drop on my knees and start praising Jesus. But I'm just too sinful to do that. But anyway, it seems to me that I was actually right about what Mike Licona thinks, which is always nice. And isn't it amazing that you can actually predict in advance what various Christian apologists are going to say, right? Like last time we were talking about this, it's a result of surveys from 109 scholars about what they think about authorship of the Pauline epistles. Like, were they actually written by Paul? Yes, no, don't have any opinion, right? And I mentioned last time that I think out of the 25 scholars who think that the letter to Titus was written by Paul, 23 of them also think that 1 Timothy was written by Paul. Now, I don't have any evidence of that because I didn't actually see the ballots, and it would be super interesting to have them. But I think I can actually predict it with a very high degree of confidence. And I think there was about 23 scholars who just answered yes, on every single letter except for Hebrews. So isn't it weird? Doesn't it make you think what's going on? I think, at least with these scholars, you can, if you know what they think about the authorship of 2 Timothy, you can actually estimate with a very high degree of confidence what their position is going to be on abortion. Isn't that weird? You know, how the universe works, how these like seemingly unrelated things might actually be interconnected. Yeah, but anyway. So, I mean, if I'm correct, if this is what Mike Licona thinks, and he, by the way, seems to suggest that there are other conservative, evangelical, Christian New Testament scholars who share the same opinion. Supposedly, he mentioned Dave Allison being one of them. That's just amazing, right? Like, not even these people defend the traditional authorship when it comes to the Gospel of Mark, right? So last time we were talking about how in ancient sources, there were actually at least 4 different people that the Gospel of John was attributed to. Well, you can kind of do the same thing with the Gospel of Matthew, right? We have now more than one plausible author. We have the Gospel of Matthew, written by Matthew the tax collector, but we could also have the Gospel of Matthew written by some other guy that we don't have any information about, right? So I think this should lower our credence in the traditional authorship even more. And that also means that every single early Christian author who says who the author of the Gospel of Mark was incorrect. Right? If Mike Licona is correct, they all got it wrong, starting from Origen. Because as far as I know, he's the first one to specifically identify the author of the Gospel of Matthew as Matthew the tax collector. And to be fair, Origen was writing in the middle of the 3rd century, so about 150 years after the Gospel of Matthew was written. But still, here you can actually use one of the talking points of Christian apologists and turn it against them. Do you know how they always say, well, if you don't believe this, you would have to give up almost everything that we know about ancient history? Well, you could say, and I'm not saying that you should say it, I'm just saying it would be equally dumb, that if you reject what Origen and everyone else after him says about the Gospel of Matthew and who wrote it, you should reject almost everything that we know about ancient history. Because almost everything that we know about ancient history comes from sources that are even later than Origen in relation to the Gospel of Matthew, right? And do you know what's one of the things that you would have to reject? Much of the Old Testament. Because much of the Old Testament, like most of the events that it describes, is actually, or at least the big important events, towards the beginning of the Old Testament specifically, is actually comes from sources that are significantly more removed from the events than 150 years, right? So let's just look at this. This is the dating of various Old Testament books. This is just like one possible way how to date them. There are obviously controversies about when the various books were written. So some people might disagree with this, but let's just use this for illustration. Let's just pick an arbitrary point, let's say here, which is the earliest plausible date for example, the Deuteronomistic history, like the books of Kings, the books of Chronicles. Let's just put 150 years in front of it. And all of the events that are described earlier, you would have to reject, right? Because you're rejecting Origen. And Origen is 150 years removed from the Gospel of Matthew. So by the same standard, you should at least doubt that everything that the Old Testament describes as taking place before this period of time, you should doubt. Unless you, of course, subscribe to the Mosaic authorship, which I don't think even among conservative Christians, there are not many people who would be still willing to buy that bullet. I don't think that the types of Mike Lacona would subscribe to the documentary to the mosaic authorship hypothesis, right? And specifically with the books of Kings and with books of Chronicles, it's of course a little bit more complicated because they actually name sources, right? So, yeah, like you could feasibly get even further than 150 years on when the specific sources that they mentioned were written. Yeah, by the way, did you guys know that the books of Kings and the books of Chronicles actually name sources? And the Gospels don't? At least not the Gospel of Mark, the Gospel of Matthew, Luke, and Acts. So they refer to works that are now lost. We don't have them. We only know of them because these books that are preserved refer to them. But we know that they existed, supposedly, right? The books of Acts of Solomon, the books of the Annals of the Kings of Judah, and a separate, supposedly, work, the books of the Annals of the Kings of Israel. It's quite a mouthful, but I'm sure it works much better in Hebrew. So yeah, even the historical books, historiographical books of the Old Testament cite sources when they are using sources. Isn't it great? Isn't that exactly what we were talking about when we were talking about ancient historians 2 weeks ago? And isn't that exactly like the examples I was giving you? If that's the case here, and if the Gospels were written in the genre of ancient historiography, why don't we see the Gospels, except for the Gospel of John, of course, telling you who the sources are? Isn't it unexpected on that genre? Especially given that the Gospel of Matthew is supposed to be written by an eyewitness, and given that the Gospel of Luke uses Mark as a source, but never says that. The Gospel of Matthew uses Mark as a source, but never says that. And the Gospel of Mark is supposedly written by as an eyewitness testimony of Peter, but it never says that. Yeah, so these are just some random things that make me wonder. Which brings us to the main topic of this stream. And the stream is titled the 1 Corinthians 15 Creed. It actually contains evidence against the traditional authorship. And if you know anything about the exciting world of Christian apologetics, then your mind like exploded as soon as you read the title, right? It was like the scene from what was the movie? Well, now from The Boys, right? There you have people with exploding heads. So I think that was something that might have actually happened to you. And the reason is that in Christian apologist circles, the 1 Corinthians 15 Creed is actually used as evidence in favor of the empty tomb and not because of it. And today, in this stream, I will actually show you that not only is it not evidence in favor of the empty tomb, it's actually evidence against it. So what am I talking about, right? Let's actually play a video. It's about 1 minute, and it's just William Lane Craig in, I think, 4 of his different lectures, talking about how the 1 Corinthians 15 Creed is supposed to be evidence in favor of the empty tomb. And we will just pick it apart, and I will show you what the evidence against is later. So let's go. Hold on.
The old information transmitted by Paul implies the empty tomb. It does so in 2 ways. First,
let me guys know if you can hear it.
He was buried implies an empty grave. A first-century Jew could not have thought otherwise. Second, the expression "on the 3rd day" is probably a reference to the day of the women's discovery of the empty tomb. Thus, we have 2 extremely early indications of the fact of the empty tomb. The empty tomb is also mentioned in the early sermons, in the Acts of the Apostles, and implied by Paul in his letter to the church in Corinth. Thus, we have early, multiple, independent attestation of the fact of the empty tomb, one of the most important indications of historicity. Jesus' empty tomb is also mentioned in the early sermons.
It's also mentioned in the early sermons preserved
in the Acts of the Apostles. And it's implied in the very
by
old
the very
tradition.
old church.
Thus we have early attestation of the fact of the empty tomb,
independent
in at least
attestation of
four
the fact of the empty
independent
tomb.
sources.
This
Therefore, it
shows
can't
that the
be
empty
a
tomb
Markan
narrative was not
literary
a fiction
creation, as
created
Richard
by
mentions.
Mark.
So there you go, guys. This was William Lane Craig. And by the way, those debates were actually years apart, right? And I wouldn't be surprised if one could Google very early debates by William Lane Craig, where he says almost exactly the same thing, word for word. I think if we found those two transcripts of those two opening arguments on two different manuscripts, I think we would be pretty justified in thinking that there is a genetic link between them, right? Because the verbal parallels are very, very striking. Yeah, so what is he actually talking about, right? So there is a piece of early Christian literature called the First Corinthians, is the first epistle that we have that Paul sent to the Church of Corinth. And there is a passage in chapter 15 where he says, "For I handed on to you as of first importance what I in turn had received, that Christ died for our sins in accordance with the scriptures, and that he was buried, and that he was raised on the third day in accordance with the scriptures, and that he appeared to Cephas or Cephas, then to the 12. Then he appeared to more than 500 brothers and sisters at one time, most of whom are still alive, though some have died. Then he appeared to James, then to all of the apostles. Last of all, as to one untimely born, he appeared also to me." So this seems to be a summary of an early, at least parts of it, appear to be a summary of some early tradition or early material that Christians were passing to each other orally. Why do we think that? So this is like not Paul's original creation. He's citing something that is older than him, that comes, he got that information from someone else, right? From other men. So why do we think that? Why do scholars think that? By the way, not everyone thinks that, right? Like there are some scholars who think that it could be original to Paul. This isn't actually an earlier material. It isn't a creed or kerygma. And there are some scholars who even think that this is an interpolation. It wasn't actually in the original manuscripts. One of the people who thinks that is, for example, Robert Price, and you can check his research on that. I'm not completely sold by the idea, but I think some of the arguments that he brings should lower the confidence, our confidence in the alternative hypotheses, including the hypothesis that this is actually an earlier creed. And the reason why some scholars think this is actually earlier than Paul is because, one, some of the vocabulary and some of the morphology of some of the words are very atypical, or for Paul, or they actually don't appear anywhere else in the Pauline letters. So this suggests he's just repeating something that was formulated by someone else who was just using different vocabulary and using the language differently. It's perfectly fine. This is how scholars identify this kind of older tradition in written sources, right? And the second reason is that it seems to have some kind of poetic structure. So it's not composed as kind of free prose where the ideas just flow, but it seems to have some kind of internal structure. And the idea is that it has this structure in order to facilitate easier recollection from memory, right? So when people were passing this along, they formulated it such that it was easier to commit to memory and easier to recall from memory, right? And what does this have to do with the empty tomb? So if you actually look at it, it doesn't mention the empty tomb anywhere, right? So this is the idea. In the Gospels, we have the description of the empty tomb, and the description of the empty tomb and the rest of the Passion story and the story of Jesus' post-resurrection appearances suggests that it was a physical resurrection, right? So Jesus was actually raised physically. So the location of his body, the place where his body was before he was raised, became empty. The body went missing. His body was no longer where he was buried, right? Well, this is what the Gospels describe. And if you actually look at the 1 Corinthians 15 creed, it just says that he was buried. And the argument that the apologists are making is, look, the early Christians believe that resurrections are in the body, they are bodily, which means if you could go back in time and ask them, do you think that Jesus' body is where he was buried? They would obviously say no. We think that when someone is resurrected, his body is no longer where it was buried because he just like gets up and leaves, right? So even though the 1 Corinthians 15 creed doesn't mention Jesus being buried in a tomb and the tomb being discovered empty later, it's reasonable to believe that this is what the story is talking about, because this is what the Christians believe happens with the body, right? Jesus was buried, that's what it says. He was buried in a tomb, and the tomb would become empty. Empty tomb. That's exactly what the Gospels describe, right? Now, is this completely stupid? Of course it is. Why is it stupid? Well, because you can very easily explain the origin of the belief in the physicality of the resurrection in light of pre-existing belief that Second Temple Jews had, right? So early Christians were Second Temple Jews, and Second Temple Jews who believed in resurrection, at least some of them, believed in physical resurrection, exactly the same kind of resurrection that's depicted in case of Jesus in the Gospels, right? So even if it was the case that if we could travel back in time and ask people who circulated the creed, for example, Paul, do you think that Jesus' body is not found where it was buried? He would say yes. It's not because he already knew about an empty tomb narrative found later in Mark. It's because of his existing worldview, a worldview that he already had before converting to Christianity, which already included the belief that resurrections are physical, right? And I was thinking super hard about some kind of analogy that I could give you. Ideally, an analogy that wouldn't be offensive to Christians. But honestly, I wasn't able to come up with anything better than alien abduction, right? So let's just go with that. So let's say there is a claim that an alien abduction took place in 1950. And we have two pieces of evidence. One piece of evidence is a report from 1965, which just describes people seeing what they believe is an alien spacecraft. And that we have a second story from 1990, which actually describes people seeing an alien spacecraft, them seeing the alien spacecraft land, them seeing actual aliens leaving the spacecraft and abducting the witnesses. Now, in this analogy, it would be analogous. What would be analogous to what Craig's saying is this. We can establish that the people who circulated the first report in 1965 already believed in alien abductions, because even though the story from, or the report from 1965 doesn't mention any abductions, because that was already a component of their worldview, right? They already thought that aliens kidnap people. But just as you can do with the 1 Corinthians 15 creed, you can very easily explain where that beliefs come from. The origin of the belief doesn't have to be an actual alien abduction. It could just be what people around 1965 already thought about alien abductions and encounters with aliens, seeing alien spacecraft and these kinds of things, right? You don't actually need to posit a real abduction in order to explain that. Analogically, you don't need to think that Paul and people who were circulating the creed already knew about the empty tomb story in order to explain them thinking that Jesus' body is no longer found where it was buried, if it is really the case that this is what they were thinking, because it can be explained equally well by physical resurrections already being components of their existing worldview, even before they became Christians, right? Just in virtue of them being Second Temple Jews. Now, of course, is it the case that Paul, for example, believed in physical resurrection? And what exactly do we mean by that? Do we think that Paul believed resurrection of the exact same time, the exact same type that's later depicted in the Gospels? It's very complicated. Like the debates about that are very complicated. There have been a lot of literature written about that. You're welcome to read it. But even if you grant that Paul actually believed in the exact same kind of resurrection as is later depicted in the Gospels, you can explain his belief very easily in virtue of Second Temple Jews holding that belief. And you can even use some materials given by apologists about that, right? So apologists actually bring up various passages in the Old Testament where people are talking about resurrections, and it seems that the resurrections are very physical. There is one very long passage that I omitted because it's too long from Ezekiel. It just shows Ezekiel having a vision of a valley full of bones, and then he prophesies to the bones, and God raises them up, and it's very physical. They have sinuses on their bones and stuff like that. And of course, there are people who think that, and it's probably true, that this was not meant to be literal. It was kind of a word picture that had a symbolic meaning. Again, very complicated. But if you are debating a Christian apologist, you can just grant, and this is what he's going to believe, that Second Temple Jews, including later early Christians, already believed in physicality of the resurrection. You can very easily explain the content of the 1 Corinthians 15 Creed and any imaginary beliefs of the people who circulated it, including Paul, that way. Right? We even have some examples of very physical description of the resurrection in apocryphal literature. This is, for example, 4th Ezra. Yeah, and by the way, of course, not everyone in Second Temple period believe in physical resurrections. We know that Sadducees, that was one of the 3 largest sects of Second Temple Judaism that is mentioned by Josephus, they didn't believe in physical resurrections because they actually didn't believe in any resurrections, which is really interesting. And why is that? Have you ever asked yourself, if you know about this, why is it the case that just Sadducees rejected resurrection? They were all Second Temple Jews. They had the same religious texts, right? Because they wouldn't be Jews otherwise. Why did they reject resurrections? Doesn't it very clearly says in the Old Testament that dead will be raised? Haven't I just shown you some examples from the Old Testament where this says that? Well, it turns out Josephus actually says why the Sadducees have different religious beliefs from the other Second Temple Jewish sect. That is the second passage. And it's because they just rejected some of the religious texts, right? This mentions them specifically rejecting the oral law. They only subscribe to the written law. This just shows you, I think, that by the time Josephus is writing, which was the second half of the 1st century, the Old Testament canon wasn't actually closed, and that different Jewish sects accepted and rejected different books of the Old Testament. Sadducees, very probably, rejected all of the Old Testament books that described what seems to be a physical resurrection, or at the very least, they interpreted them very differently than how, for example, Christians interpret them today. So, yeah, I thought that's interesting. Yeah, this is actually the passage that talks about that. So feel free to pause it later, like rewatch the video. I shouldn't actually read this out loud, right? I should just tell you to rewatch the video, pause it, and read the passages for yourself. That way, I can just double the amount of views that I get on the video. Yeah, but anyway, okay. So hopefully this wasn't very confusing. And hopefully, I just explained to you why what apologists are talking about 1 Corinthians 15 creed being evidence of the empty tomb is fallacious. It's a non sequitur. The conclusion doesn't actually follow. The 1 Corinthians 15 creed isn't a source of the empty tomb. It's certainly not an independent source for the empty tomb. Because you can just explain, like even if you think that Paul believed that Jesus's body is no longer where it was buried, you can very easily explain that just in virtue of him being a Second Temple Jews, and Second Temple Jews already believing in physical resurrections. Okay, so let me just now show you why the 1 Corinthians 15 creed is actually evidence against the empty tomb. And I thought it would be fun to start from the manuscripts. Because again, a lot of people know a little bit about textual criticism, but I don't think that many people have actually seen a manuscript of the New Testament. So it would be interesting to just get to the specific elements of the passage, just starting from the primary sources, from the actual manuscripts that we have, right? So we will kind of start with the manuscript, and then we will kind of zoom in into the specific passages and elements of the passages that I want to talk about. So this is P56. It's one of the earliest New Testament manuscript. It's usually dated to second half or the end of the 2nd century and the beginning of the 3rd century, so around the year 200, right? It's one of the oldest manuscript of the New Testament, and it's actually the oldest surviving manuscript that contains the Pauline epistles. It doesn't contain all of them, it contains just some. And it's actually there is a really interesting debate. It's not related to the topic of today's stream, but I like digressing, so let's digress, right? So how did the manuscript originally look like? So it's just a couple of leaves of papyrus that are kind of folded like this. So it's essentially a magazine, right? So you have different leaves folded and put together like a magazine. And then the scribe who did that started writing like from the first page, going through it as you would writing in like a notebook, for example. But then at some point later, some of the leaves got lost. And it was the outer leaves, which means we don't have the beginning and the end of the manuscript. We just have the middle. But we can estimate what was on these missing leaves based on what is in the extant leaves, the middle of the work, right? The middle of the manuscript. The leaves that we do have start with the ending of the letter to the Romans. So it's very, very probable, I would say it's almost certain, that at least some of the space on the beginning of the manuscript that is now lost contained the rest of the Romans, so the beginning of the Romans, right? And if you actually calculate the average number of letters on the surviving leaves, and you extrapolate how much space would be needed, given that density of the text, to write down the rest of the Romans, it almost exactly fits how much space they would be on the missing leaves, right? So it just started with Romans, the same way how today New Testament, the section of the New Testament that contains the Pauline epistles starts with Romans. Then it went through the epistles. But the question is where it ended, right? Because again, we can estimate how much space there was at the end of the manuscript on the leaves that were lost. And the thing is that given the average density of the text, it looks like there wasn't enough space for all of the epistles that were traditionally attributed to Paul. Now, if it was the case that the epistles were not in the manuscript, this would be, I would say, pretty good evidence against authenticity of those manuscripts, of those epistles, sorry. It would be a really good evidence in favor of them being forgeries, because we would have the earliest manuscript of Pauline epistles missing them, which means that by the time when it was produced, they were either not considered authentic, and that's why they were not part of the manuscript, or even better yet, they have not been written. So, but it's actually more complicated. It's not that straightforward, because someone noticed that the density of the text gets bigger and bigger. The text gets denser and denser. There is more and more letters on every page as the manuscript goes on. And it seems that the scribe at some point actually realized that he doesn't have enough space for all the text that he wants to write down, and he started compensating. So that makes the evidence much, much weaker, I would say. But it's still really, really interesting stuff, right? So again, very complicated, galaxy brain takes, but still interesting nevertheless, right? So this is just one leaf, one side of one leaf out of the manuscript. And this is the section that contains the 1 Corinthians 15 creed. Here, for example, we have the word for Christ, Christos, in the beginning of the creed, right? Christ died for our sins. This is how it looks like. And the rest of the page is just the rest of the creed. As you can see, it's damaged. So here in the earliest extant manuscript, we actually have this specific passage preserved partially, but it is, of course, preserved in full in later manuscripts. There isn't any textual variant. So in the earliest manuscript that we have it, the text looks exactly the same. I would say there are maybe some minor grammatical differences, but it's not like it's missing in some manuscripts or it says something drastically different in different manuscripts or anything like that. But it's still super spicy. Okay, so the first thing that we want to probably do with that is just transcribe it, right? So we will just take the letters and we will rewrite them in uppercase alphabet, Greek alphabet, right? And immediately you'll notice one thing, and it's, first of all, it's missing diacritics, and also it's even missing spaces in between words. Because, and I don't know if that many people know about it, spaces in between words just wasn't a thing in antiquity for the most part, right? Just wasn't a meme. It wasn't an idea that people had at that point in time. That actually comes later. I think in the Byzantine manuscripts, you start having words separated. Actually, now that I think about it, it might already been the case in late antiquity. I would have to look it up. But by and large, when you see a manuscript from antiquity, it's not going to have any spaces between words, which makes it kind of difficult to read, right? I mean, one of the reasons why this is the case probably was to save writing space, right? Because you can just make it much, much denser. And papyrus was very expensive. It was very, very expensive to produce books. So this was just a way how to save space, probably. But it makes it very difficult to read, especially if you consider that, for example, children in schools learned how to read and write from manuscripts looking like this. And it's even worse. They learned it by reading Homer, which is very, very difficult text to read, not only for people today, but also already for people in antiquity, because it was written in a very specific epic dialect of ancient Greek. It's not epic because it was like epic, although I would say it's pretty epic. It's just a technical term. But like imagine something like this and giving it to a 6-year-old as a pedagogical didactic material, right? This is, by the way, a legitimate English text. again, you can pause it and you can try to read it. I'm not going to tell you what it is. I specifically selected text which is written in archaic English. It's not Shakespeare, by the way. I'm not that obvious, but I think it's from like mid 19th century, if I'm not mistaken, right? So that kind of simulates how different Epic Greek was from what a 6-year-old in first century spoke in Greece, right? And then, of course, it's much more difficult because I removed diacritics like commas, dots, exclamation points, and all the spaces between words. So yeah, pretty crazy stuff. Okay, but let's get back to our manuscript. We can just the text into normal, sensible, readable Greek by adding diacritics and by adding spaces between words. And we can already start noticing some interesting things about the manuscript. So if you actually see the passage in, or the segment in yellow, that's the word Christos, Christ. And in the manuscript, it's written by just 3 Greek letters, He, Rho, and Sigma. Here it's lunar sigma, so it looks like letter C. It's not written out full, and there is kind of a line on top of it. This is called Nomina Sacra, a sacred name, and you see it all over ancient manuscripts, not just Christian manuscripts, but some others, where names of deities, like Jesus, would not be written out like in full, but they would just be abbreviated. I'm not actually sure about the theory between this. The 2 ideas that come to mind is, again, saving space and making it more easy to, just like more convenient, more efficient, because you would have these names actually repeating quite a lot. And the second reason, which is much more interesting, has to do with literal magic, because names of deities had magical power, which translated to some specific conventions about writing down in manuscripts. And we have some examples of Gnostic texts, for example, that I definitely have to show you at some point because they are really interesting, where we think some kind of magic or these kind of practices were going on in virtue of these specific names being written down on a manuscript scroll. So that's the yellow segment. And then we have the red segment, which, and I'm not 100% sure about it, but I think it's actually just a grammatical error, right? So the scribe wrote down humane, but it should be human. It's accusative of humes, which means we. So it's us in English. So now that we have like a normal, sensible Greek text, we can actually translate it, right? So that would be my translation. I think it's pretty similar to what you get in your standard NRSV Bible. And yeah, so this is just the creed, right? So we can start analyzing the structure. And this is what now, after like an hour, we can finally get to the topic of today's video. And that's why the 1 Corinthians 15 creed is actually evidence against the empty tomb, right? So let's just start dissecting this. So first of all, we can take out all of the passages that were not originally a part of the creed. And they are original to Paul, right? So for example, the beginning and the end of the passage, obviously wasn't a part of any pre-Pauline material, because Paul here is talking about himself. He says, "For I, Paul, handed on to you as of first importance what I in turn received." So that can't be the creed, right? The creed probably didn't include Paul talking about the creed. And then, of course, the end of the creed, the end of the passage was also not a part of the original creed, because it's, again, Paul is talking about himself. Last of all, as to one untimely born, he was seen also by me. So that wasn't a part of the creed either. So let's just delete it, and we are left with this. So let's go on. Now, if you read it, even in English, you will notice that it's actually contains a lot of words that are kind of repeating. They are conjunctions, like kai and hoti, and they contain adverbs, like eta, then, And now we are getting to why some scholars think that there is some kind of poetic structure in the creed, right? That this wasn't just a free prose. It was composed such that it's easy to put into your memory and get out of your memory, right? And the idea is that these connective words are actually separating different segments of the creed, of the poetic structure, right? Which means we can reconstruct the poetic structure by writing it down so that every line starts with these connective words, these connectors, right? And it would look like this. That's the hypothesis. And already if you look at it now, you might see that actually some of the lines are, for example, some of the alternating lines are looking kind of similar, right? Then we can take out this, because this was probably also original to Paul. That's the appearance to 500. Did you guys know that that wasn't originally the part of the creed, assuming this was a creed in the first place, right? So when Christian apologists bring up the creed as evidence, an early source for appearances of Jesus to various individuals and groups, that doesn't cover the appearance to 500. That probably wasn't a part of the creed. That was probably a material that Paul inserted into the creed as he was narrating it to a scribe. But it wasn't actually in it. How can we tell? Well, because of this, right? Just look at it. It's obviously too long, and it doesn't fit the poetic structure. So the hypothesis goes, it wasn't a part of the creed, which means we can throw it out as well. And we have the creed in its original glory. So this would be supposedly what early Christians were circulating as a summary of their faith before Paul wrote. So here we go. Christ died for our sins in accordance with the scriptures. He was buried. He was raised on the third day in accordance with the scriptures. He was seen by Cephas, or Cephas, by the 12. Then he was seen by James, and then by all of the apostles. Okay? So let's visualize it like this. Let's look at the various segments. So you already noticed that there are two instances of according to the scripture. So this is what I'm talking about when I'm talking about poetic structure, because here we have examples of poetic repetition. And as you can see, the sentence or the segment according to the scripture is in both cases introduced by or preceded by a relatively long string of words. So in first case, it's Christ died for our sins. And in the second case, he was raised on the third day, right? So again, these two lines would be kind of parallel in that structure. And then we have this, which means by the 12, and then by all the apostles. So again, this looks like it's these two lines are kind of parallel, right? So they look the same, and they're essentially talking about a similar thing, an appearance of Jesus to a group of people. In the first case, it's to the 12, and then the second case, it's to all of the apostles. Which means, and this is the grand finale of today's stream, so I hope you are excited and that you find this interesting. We are left with this. And tell me what's weird about it. More specifically, what's missing? And I'm going to make it a question for 1,000 pine points. And I will actually wait for the stream to catch up with me. And I'll wait for your comments. So let's play some soothing elevator music, because I think the stream is behind by like 10 seconds. Okay. I think Brett Losky got it. Can you be more specific? It's I think you're not specific enough. This is for like 100 points, right? What is missing in that, or what's weird, right? What's missing? So supposedly we have 3 parallel lines. They are both this in both cases the verb is in a past tense, which is called aorist, and it's in the passive voice. It's quite similar, right? The two in the two instances, there is the verb for seeing. So Jesus was seen, and then there is he was buried. Okay, I think nobody got it. Yeah, okay, let's just call it. So nobody's going to get 1,000 points. Yeah, nobody got it. Okay, never mind, right? So maybe you're gonna get it next time. Well, the idea, and by the way, this is not original to me. This is mentioned, for example, by Bart Ehrman in How Jesus Became God. I wasn't able to find that much additional scholarship on this, and I forgot to mention that at the very beginning, and that's a huge faux pas. I was reminded of this by Matthew Ferguson. I don't know if you know him. He's a scholar who, for a very long time, had an excellent blog, Celsus.org, I think that was. It should be still available. Amazing stuff. A lot of really interesting articles. And yeah, he was just talking about this recently on Facebook. And I was reminded of it, and I thought it would be a really great topic for a stream, right? So yeah, the idea is that these 3 lines are parallel, but the problem is that the poetic structure is broken, because in the last 2 lines it mentions people, but in the first line it doesn't mention any people. It doesn't mention any person, more specifically, right? So we have he was seen by Cephas, and he was seen by James, but then we have just he was buried. Wouldn't it be much better if it looked like this, for example? He was buried by Joseph, right? Wouldn't that fix it? Wouldn't it make it more poetic, more, I would say, symmetric, right? So yeah, that's the idea, right? So the 1 Corinthians 15 creed is evidence against the empty tomb because the poetic structure is broken, and it would be better, it would fit better, it would be fixed if it contained Joseph. Now, how good of an argument is this? How strong of an evidence it is? Well, it's only as strong as this is expected on the hypothesis that the story of the empty tomb was already circulated by the time Paul was writing, right? So on the hypothesis that this empty tomb story is original to Mark, or it originated at some point after 1 Corinthians 15 was written, but before the Gospel of Mark was written, I would say it's fairly expected that the creed would look like this, right? It just says he was buried, and it doesn't say by Joseph, because the story of Joseph burying Jesus hasn't existed yet. So of course, you would get essentially a defective creed because there wasn't anyone to name, right? There wasn't any name available to be included in the creed in the first place because the narrative has not been invented yet. And now the question is, if the empty tomb narrative already existed when the creed was formulated, because the empty tomb story is actually true, how expected it is that we would see the creed looking like this? This is the 1 million point question, and the answer to that question is going to tell you how strong this evidence is. And of course, it's contingent on all kinds of other things. First of all, you have to believe that this is a creed in the first place. You have to be convinced of it. Then you have to buy that it has some kind of poetic structure. And then you have to buy the specific mapping of that structure, right? Because I'm sure you can take the same Greek text and you can just rearrange the passages, or you can, I would say, arrange the passages in a slightly different way. So if you, for example, don't think that these three lines are, that there is this symmetry between these three lines, then you might say, meh, I don't really buy that, right? And I think what would make this evidence even more powerful is this. So if you actually look at the left-hand side, at the Greek text, you can see that when it comes to seeing, it just says kephai, which is a dative, and yakuboi, right? Again, dative. But when it talks about burying, etaphe, it says hippo Yosef, which isn't dative, it's genitive with the preposition hippo, which makes it fit significantly less because you have different cases. So the symmetry is broken there, right? And I was looking around Greek literature for how it was expressed that someone was buried by someone else. And it seems to be the case that it was expressed in genitive. The person doing the burial was the form of the verb of the noun was in genitive, and it was introduced by the preposition hippo. So here we have a passage from one of the dialogues of Plato where he says it's honorable or it's right to be buried by your descendants, by your children, your offspring. And it says the offspring are in genitive case, introduced by hippo. So I wasn't actually able to find any passages in the extant literature where someone being buried by someone else is expressed in the dative case. But there is an interesting twist to it, because actually, if you look at the verb seeing, which is also in the creed, it seems to me the case that in ancient Greek, the appropriate form of the noun was also genitive with the preposition hippo. So it was similar, right? So here, for example, we have a passage from Thucydides when he's talking about someone being seen by a Salaminian, a person from the island of Salamis, right? And if you actually look at, which is the exact same structure as we see, the exact same meaning that we see in the Greek. And if you actually look at the Greek, you can see that it's not in dative without a preposition, as it is the case in the Greek, in the Crete, sorry. It's actually, again, with hippo and genitive case. And I was looking around trying to figure out why is it the case that we see something in Thucydides and we see something different in the Creed when it comes to Jesus being seen by all these different people and groups of people. And it seems to be the case that in Koine Greek, which is the Greek dialect that the New Testament is written in, including 1 Corinthians, and particularly in vulgar Koine Greek, by the time the New Testament was written, it was already common to express this as dative. I'm not actually sure if we have any other examples of this apart from 1 Corinthians 15. It could be the case that this is literally the only example, and this is what the textbooks of Greek grammar are talking about, and the various dictionaries and stuff like that. But this is what the secondary literature says, right? It would be really, really spicy to find out that a similar development took place with the verb bury, thapto, right? Is it plausible? I don't know. I'm not a philologist, right? Maybe I should ask one of my professors about this. But anyway, I find it really, really interesting. If it is the case that the same development is attested, or at least plausible, for the word buried, or to bury, as it is for the verb to see, then what I was talking about now would again be much, much more plausible. And I think the strength of this evidence would go up. So yeah, this is what I wanted to say. I hope it was understandable, that I explained it correctly. Let me know maybe in the comments later if you kind of got it. Let me know how significant you think this is. Like, do you find it interesting? Is that kind of meh? Do you think this is good evidence? If yes, why? If no, why? I think it's at least interesting. I don't think it's a silver bullet, because in history there are no silver bullets usually. Apart from like literal silver bullets, archaeological finds and stuff like that. But even those kinds of things don't usually, almost never cut it like close to 100%, right? Because archaeological artifacts can't talk. You have to interpret them, and the interpretation is going to, like there are usually different interpretations available. But anyway, so yeah, that was the main topic of this stream. And now, for something completely different. And in today's episode, in my favorite segment, where we just switch gears and we talk maybe 10, 15 minutes, maybe just 5, about something completely different, I want to mention Greek theater, because I have been reading recently a very interesting book about Greek theater. And I was completely blown away, specifically by how many people were involved in production of Greek theater plays. So just some information for context, right? So this is how Athens probably looked like. It's a view from the north, overlooking the Bay of Saron, and you can see on the horizon the island of Salamis and the port of Piraeus. But this is just like kind of to give you an idea of how Athens might have looked like. Sorry, that's for later. But anyway, we are talking about theater plays in the classical period, so it's about 150 years. It's actually a very short period of time, given the total scope of ancient history, where the classical theater plays were written and performed, right? So Greek theater seems to be unique in kind of the Mediterranean basin that we usually talk about when we think about ancient history, like in the European and Middle Eastern context and like Northern African context. It seems to me that Greek theater is unique, and we don't have any evidence of any other culture developing something like this independently. We do have that for like different cultures around the world, like in Asia, in India, China, and stuff like that. But talking about the specific region of the world, it seems to be unique. It seems that it originated in the Greek world. In some ancient Near Eastern locations, we have some evidence of spaces that looks like they were built for some kind of performance, but we don't know what was it actually that was performed. And we even have some examples of ancient Near Eastern texts that look like they could be part of a theater play. For example, it's a dialogue between two characters, right? But with these kinds of texts, we don't have any evidence that they were actually performed. So theater per se seems to be original to the Greek world, and everywhere else where it was reproduced later, most notably in Rome, it was only introduced under Greek influence. Right. We don't know how Greek theater actually originated, and it's not a trivial question, right? Like, just the fact that it seems that Greeks were the first ones and the only ones actually in this part of the world who came up with it makes you think, where does it originate from? It's probably almost certainly developed from religious festivals, but we don't know exactly when and how. They were, of course, two main genres, comedy and tragedy. And we can like glean some maybe origins from etymology, because in comedy we hear komos, which was a parade or procession, a revel It was very loud, very kind of colorful. Let's say a dance party, probably similar to the parade in Rio de Janeiro, the Grand Festival. I don't know how they call it in English. Today, right, in Brazil. And that was obviously part of a religious festival. Oide, the second part of the world, is a song. And tragedy comes from tragos, which means a goat. And we don't exactly know how goat fits into it. Probably either the actors, the very first actors before theater was invented, were dancing around a goat, sacrificial goat. They were dressed as goats, or a goat was a prize for a winner in some kind of competition that this kind of genre developed from. Comedy probably comes from Sicily, from the Greek-speaking world, but it seems to be the case that tragedy is original to Athens, not to the city, but more specifically to the countryside of Attica surrounding the city of Athens. But we don't know. Theater wasn't only played in Athens, but we, like almost everything, to be honest, that we know about Greek theater in the classical period, so the second half of the 6th century, first half of the 4th century, comes from Athens, right? And there, during those like 150 years where the classical Greek theater was being performed, hundreds and hundreds of plays were written and performed, but we only have surviving plays in any kind of completion from 4 authors, right? 3 authors of tragedy, Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides, and 1 author of comedy, Aristophanes, right? So what other interesting things are there? Well, the content of the plays is, of course, really interesting. Comedy was funny, but the point of comedy in the classical period was political satire. This is actually really interesting. So Athens, as far as we know, was the first political system, the first state in human history where the state funded criticism of its own politics. This is very, very important, right? Because, of course, organization of Greek plays was funded by the state. More specifically, the state mandated organization of religious festivals, including theater plays, and it appointed specific wealthy individuals that were responsible, they were obligated to fund organization of the plays from their own private funds. But because comedy was very subversive, it was satirizing specific political leaders and specific policies in the city of Athens. It's the first instance where any state actually paid someone to criticize what it's doing. I think this is extremely important in the development of not just Western, but like human political thought, right? That you have a country which is so secure and so confident in its own ideals that it can actually it can stand not only criticism, there are actually people allowed to criticize politics and political leaders, and they are not burdened by the stake. It's actually a country which is so confident in its own ideals that it funds criticism of its own politics. If you think about it, especially in the context of ancient and then medieval history, completely mental, right? But for the same reason, the texts of comedies are completely opaque or almost completely opaque, right? Because they contain references to specific Athenian politicians and specific incidents around the time when they were written, which more often than not, today we don't know anything about, right? So you just read it, but you feel as you're reading it that 90% of the jokes and references you're not getting because you don't know what they are making fun of, right? You don't know what they are joking about because the people are already dead. And it was very like local and immediate events. In some cases, we do have like pretty good idea what they are referencing, but it would be like 2,000 years from now, historians finding some like meme compilations from YouTube. They wouldn't probably be able to tell what the people were talking about because it's like coded in very specific language, like visual language and verbal language, and it's making fun of events that the historians are not going to have any access to because they will be just gone, right, from history. They won't know what copium is. They would know maybe that at the end of the year 2020, there was a thing called the Great American Opioid Crisis, but they wouldn't know what it was about because that information would be lost. And this is kind of what it is like classical comedies from Athens. And tragedies are usually about ancient mythology or about history, a fairly recent history. Like, for example, the oldest extant Greek theater play that we have, The Persians by Aeschylus, is about the victory of the Greeks in the Persian Wars, and it was fairly recent history. But usually it's about mythology. But again, it was very poetically relevant. The point of the tragedies was to use mythology to communicate, to deliver a message which is important politically, which was politically important to the people, to the audience at the point. One example would be the Eumenides, which is the last play in the Orestes cycle, where Orestes is haunted by the Furies, Eurynes, because he killed his own mother, Clytemnestra. And Furies were creatures that were specifically responsible. Their task was to punish people who killed their own parents. So they are doing it. But they're kind of doing it just mechanically because it's their nature. They are not concerned whether what they are doing is actually just in any kind of like a greater sense, right? But in case of Orestes, it might be just because he, yes, killed his own mother, but it was to revenge assassination of his father, because Agamemnon very famously was assassinated by Clytemnestra, right? So the question is him being haunted by Furies justified or not? Did he kill his father? Did he kill his mother rightfully or not, right? And this is what the play deals with. Orestes appeals to Athena, and Athena actually sets up a court tribunal in Athens on Areopagos, Ares' hill, and the conflict is actually resolved by a vote cast by this tribunal. And it's, of course, the famous Areopagos. It's the myth of how Areopagos was established as an institution in Athens. And the reason why that play exists and why it was written and performed in that specific period in time is because that was the point in time when Areopagos was completely stripped of almost all of its political power. There was actually a major reform in Athenian political system, and this was like a negative reaction. The point of the play was to show how Areopagos was important as a political institution by showing the myth of its origin and how traditionally or historically important point it played. Okay, this is already taking too long, so I will wrap it up. What's very important to realize about Greek theater is that it was a religious festival, right? So this is completely dissimilar to how movies and theater works today. It was equivalent to, for example, Eastern Christian Mass or Christmas Mass, right? So not just a Christian Mass, but specific masses in specific, like during specific religious festivals, right? Because you couldn't just go to theater like anytime you wanted. It wasn't like there were theater plays played, every night or something like that, or once a week. It was only performed during a handful of specific dedicated days as a part of religious festivals that involved much more activity than just this. There were, of course, all the sacrifices, all the ritual processions. And then, of course, there were various competitions. For example, dithyrambus competitions, a recitation of the Homeric epics and stuff like that. Various sport competitions. Greek were very competitive, agonistic people. And actually, performing theater was a competition. Again, this is something completely like dissimilar to how theater functions today. So not only you could only see a theater play during specific religious festivals a couple times a year, you always, as an audience member, could see multiple different plays, usually performed in the same day. So you would actually, during that like 5 different days a year, you would spend up to 10 hours in theater, because you would see like several different plays. And then there would be specific committee that would select a winner. We don't know like how this committee was formed and what were the criteria. But yeah, like one of the people won. One of the poets won. And what's very important is that the plays were specifically written for the occasion. They were usually not repeated. Repetition of plays is attested much later. And what's even more important and unfortunate is that they were not written down. So the poet just composed it, the actors learned it, they performed it just once, and then it was never performed again, and it was forgotten, right? So out of the hundreds of plays that we have, almost all of them were completely lost almost immediately, right? Which is insane, because they are really good, like the ones that we have. And by the way, the ones that we have are not usually the ones that won. That's really interesting, right? And the reason why we have them is because at some point, one of the prizes for the winner was the privilege of his play being actually written down and archived in the archive of Athens. And that started the meme of people writing these plays down. That's how the idea that you could actually have like a library of these really good plays on papyrus scroll at home. That's how that idea started. And we don't have the plays that were actually in the archive of Athens, because that archive was stolen by one of the early Ptolemaic kings in Egypt, and it became a part of the Library of Alexandria, which was later destroyed, unfortunately. But we have at least some plays and quite a large number of fragments. But yeah, what I was completely blown away by when I was reading this book about Greek theater is just how many people participated in the process of performance, right? So in the classical period, so around the year, let's say 450, Attica, so the whole polis of Athens, would have about 300,000 people. And only about 40,000 of them would be male citizens. So people who could actually actively participate. The rest were slaves, foreigners, women, and other population. And it's actually estimated that at least 25 new plays had to be composed every year. And if you actually count all the different people that were involved in organizing it, the total number is about 1,300, which I think is completely mental if you realize that almost all of these people were amateurs, which means they didn't have any formal training and they were just doing it as their religious duty, right? It was highly coordinated, and just like so many people participated, right? So Athenians, culturally speaking, well, actually a very educated audience, even though they were laymen, because they, like most of them, would probably get at least once in their life opportunity to participate in this theater production. And this is, again, something that is not true today. Like today we have professional actors and their number compared to the total population is completely insignificant, right? And then we have everyone else who is just a consumer. Most people don't participate in theater, right? But in Athens, it seems to be the case that the audience members were by and large also the organizers and the participants in this religious activity, right? Which is really, really interesting. You have to count all the actors, of course. You have to count all the chorus members. You have to count all the people that, for example, built sets, operated sets, and these kinds of things. Yeah. So yeah, that's what I wanted to tell you. Let me see if I have some interesting pictures. This is Acropolis. The Theater of Dionysus, which was the largest theater in Athens, is actually on the other side of the Acropolis hill. So you can't see it here. Yeah, this is Agora. So that's the place where Socrates was bothering people. My hot take, by the way, the execution of Socrates was completely justified. I have to talk about it a little bit later at some point during my stream, but yeah, I think that he definitely deserved to die, and that he did corrupt the youth in Athens. And this is the Theater of Dionysus. So that's it. How did you guys like it? Let me know. And I think that's it. Another stream successfully performed. Mission accomplished. And I guess I will see you guys next week. Next week we might do an after party on Discord. Link in the Discord to the Discord is of course in the video description, as always. I can't do it this week because I have some reading that I have to do for tomorrow. But yeah, I think that would be fun. So thank you guys for watching, and have a nice rest of the week, and have a nice the rest of the day of celebration of the end of the First World War.